Welcome to the very first episode of Genetics in the Paddock. I'm your host, Emily Johnston, and I'll be taking you along on my journey to learn about all things genetics in extensive livestock. Livestock genetics has always been a topic that's interested me, and now working in this space, it's fascinated me even more with just how powerful of a tool it can be. I'm surrounded by so many knowledgeable people who are always so willing to share their insight, so I thought, why not capture these conversations on a podcast we can all learn from? For our very first episode, I spoke with David Johnston, a principal scientist at the Animal Genetics and Breeding Unit in Armidale. He gives a fantastic introduction into genetics and how utilising genetic tools can be beneficial for livestock producers. So you'll want to stick around for this one. And so with that, let's get into it.
Thanks, Emily. Great to be here. Yeah, my name's David Johnston. I'm a quantitative geneticist here at the Animal Genetics and Breeding Unit. I've been here more than 30 years as a scientist, so I've had a great career in the development of breed plan, the genetic evaluation for Australian beef cattle, but also been involved in all three beef CRCs and also other MLA projects, MLA funded projects. And the most recent one that I run is a large project in Queensland and the Northern Territory called Repronomics, where we've been intensively recording female reproduction and looking at the genetics of that to better describe the genetic variability that exists in female reproduction in our northern breeds, where reproduction is a real key focus. And this work that we've been doing now for more than 10 years is allowing us to quantify the size of those genetic differences for reproduction, overlaying that with genomics, allowing genomic selection to improve reproduction rates, weaning rates in Northern Australia.
That sounds like a massive project, and it's taking a lot of your time, and as well it's going to provide some really great outcomes for the beef industry in the north. But I suppose going back to basics, like what is genetics and why is it something that we should be considering as breeders?
Yeah, good question. Genetics is the underlying biology of all organisms, that the way that we reproduce and transmit to the next generation is through our DNA. And all animals, all organisms have DNA which transmits through heritable traits to the next generation. And so whilst every animal is 100% unique, there's large amounts of genetic variation that we can then capture. And as animal breeders and as breeders of livestock or plants, we can use that variation through selection to improve what we do to feed the world in terms of food production, fibre production. Lots of different production systems rely on genetics to be able to get those products in an efficient manner, and we can use more and more techniques to use that underlying biology, that underlying genetic variation, to make genetic improvement to help feed the world.
So when we talk about genetic improvement and we look at livestock specifically, what are some areas that we can actually target to improve with the current tools we've got available?
Well, we can target almost any trait or attribute that we might deem to have an economic benefit. And in some cases that might be straight profit. In other cases it might be to do with welfare, or it could be to do with other traits like reproduction. So we can use that genetic variation and through modern techniques be able to describe the genetics of those animals, and therefore the commercial producers can then acquire those genetics and use them on their own, in their own farms or own properties.
Yeah. So I suppose a lot of people, when they are purchasing a bull or a ram or a sire for their breeding program, a lot of people sort of look to those visual traits. So what does genetics give, or the understanding of genetics give, versus that visual sort of assessment when you're buying something? What is the benefit there in comparison to that?
Well, the visual assessment is critical. So when we're buying replacement sires or replacement females, they have to be functional. So we can't get away from that. But the key to genetics is that we're looking at what is transmitted of those attributes to the next generation. And so whilst a bull could be very well fed and be very big weight, that's not necessarily predictor that his progeny will be big weight. So what we're looking at with genetics is the attributes of an individual or a population that are transmitted to the next generation, because it's the progeny of the bull that you buy that's important. The bull you buy, he has to have good feet, he's got to have good legs, he's got to have good temperament, he's got to be able to walk. But the attributes of his own are really irrelevant. It's what his progeny do that are what's economically important. And that's the same in any of our species. So yes, we've got to well describe the animal for their physical attributes to be able to deliver those genetic improvement, but it's really the progeny that we're focused on. And that's what our estimated breeding value products, our EBVs, are describing about the bull. It's the expected difference in his progeny's performance, not necessarily his own, that's important.
That makes complete sense. So I suppose when we're looking at genetics, is it fair to say that there are a lot of traits that we can't visually see that genetics allows us to then have a look and say, okay, I can select an animal based on this, but I wouldn't be able to know that otherwise, like various reproduction traits and things like that? Is that also a key driver for, making selection based on genetics and how it can boost your decision making and help you pick the right animal for your breeding program as well?
Sure. So there are some attributes of an animal that you can determine quite well visually. But there are lots of traits that affect profitability in all our production systems that you can't necessarily see. You might be able to measure them. If you can measure them, then we can use them. So that's always been the key, is what are our, particularly if we can do objective measures, but sometimes we can also use scores and subjective measures to make genetic improvement in a particular trait. So the critical thing is to be able to measure the animals. And the visual will give you certain traits, but again, it's critical that because traits are affected by both the genetics and the environment, when we produce an EBV, we separate the environment from the genetics. And so when you look at a good bull, let's say, you can't tell with your eyes, is that been because he's had a good environment or because he carries good genes? And so the eye, although it might say he's a good bull, it might be simply because he's had a very good environment, like a very good feed bucket. And so you've got to be able to compare that animal to another animal that's had the same feeding regime, such that we then separate out the genetics, because it's only the genetics that will be transmitted to the next generation. And so if he's had a really good feed bucket, that feed bucket is not heritable. It doesn't get transmitted to the next generation. And so that's what we're doing when we're visually looking at a bull. Yes, that gives you some cues, but it's really been able to use our modern tools that have only been around for the last 50 years in terms of separating them. And now with the advent of things like genomics, we're able to look more at the DNA level, but still we're looking to describe the genetic differences that animal has that will be transmitted to its next generation, its progeny.
That makes so much sense. I suppose genetics makes a great way to be able to compare two animals that are, one might have had a lot more feed and one's had a lot less, but it takes away the element of the food that it's received and, how it's been prepped for the sale, and it looks amazing compared to something that might not have been. So that sounds, like a great tool for producers to be able to use to make those decisions. But I noticed you mentioned something about genomics. So can you just break down what that is in basic terms and why that plays into the selection criteria as well, or how it might help with that?
Yeah, well, the genetic evaluation system that we use is a very complex statistical procedure. And so, as we said, we're looking to separate the genetics from the environment. To be able to do that, we need the physical record, so like a birth weight, a weaning weight, a scrotal circumference. But we also need to know which animals, the age of those animals, so we can adjust for things like the age of the animal itself, the age of its mother. We've got to be then able to partition out the environment, so we need to know what paddock this animal has been in, who else has been in that paddock, and critically we need to know the pedigree. So in all our circumstances we're using a combination of the record, the management and the pedigree to be able to separate the environment such that we get at the prediction of the animal's breeding value. More recently, we've now getting access to the ability to look at the actual DNA on an animal with gene markers initially, and now with what's called SNP chips. And so these allow us to look at across the whole genome of an animal, a snapshot of its genomics, its DNA profile. And we're able to now, with our most recent genetic evaluations in breed plan, for example, since 2017, we now use that DNA profile in our genetic evaluation. And so it gives us a greater accuracy of our breeding values on younger animals. And the biggest example has been to date is the Holstein industry, the dairy industry, particularly in the US. They've used genomics since about 2009 to massively change their genetic selection. Whilst they're getting some increase in accuracy, the main thing is that they're getting increased accuracy in yearling bulls. Whereas dairy in the past used to have to progeny test those bulls, because the thing about visual for dairy, you can't see milk in a dairy bull. So we were talking earlier about seeing a trait. Well, there's a trait. When you look at a bull, you cannot see milk production. So to get selection in dairy, they had to progeny test. Use that bull, keep daughters, grow those daughters out, milk them, get those milk records. By the time you then make that selection, that bull is 7 years old. We can now make that selection decision at 1 year. So the generation interval has gone from something like 7 down to a bit over 1 in dairy. And that's massively changed how they breed, or how fast they can breed dairy cattle. So that's an example of how we've incorporated the genomics now to make what we do more accurate. It's nothing, it's still just a part of the tool, but it's allowing us to do it much more accurately because we're able to look at specifically, using the genomics of individuals.
That sounds amazing, to be able to shorten the generation interval from when you can make decisions from 7 year to 1 year. That is an absolute huge change, especially, considering how many decisions would have been made in that 7 year period as well. It sounds just like genomics is really boosting the way, genetics is being used as well. And with the accuracies, having a more accurate animal gives you a bit more of a indication of where things might be going in the future if you pick that animal too, which is an amazing tool for producers to be able to utilise now. Touching on examples as well, are there any other sort of bigger examples or any other different examples that you've noticed over your time working in genetics, because you've had quite a long career in this industry and area? Are there any other major changes that you've seen industry-wide from using genetic selection and picking certain traits where an industry's completely shifted in a short span of time because of that selection pressure they've put on certain traits for either market requirements or just to improve their breeding herd or anything along those lines?
Yeah, well, it's always evolving. It's changing. Our markets are changing. Our production systems are changing. Our consumer requirements are changing. And with genetics, you're able to, use selection to make those animals more fitting those production systems. So, in the early days, we started with growth because that was very easy to measure. But very quickly, we started to see that there are many more traits that drive profitability other than just growth rate. So the advent of doing breeding objectives, and I know you're going to talk about that soon, being able to say, well, what are the profit drivers? And those profit drivers change. As feed costs change, we're going to see more pressure on, feed intake. As the methane debate continues, we're going to see more pressure on changing the methane output. So we have to be able to say, well, how does our genetic evaluation and how does our selection cope with those changes. So yeah, we've been changing the traits over time, mainly informed by what the breeding objective is telling us. What is our breeding goal? What are our markets? So the opening up of the Japanese market in the mid-80s put marbling fair and square on our radar. Up until that point, we had domestic markets, we had US export markets, but that opening up of that Japanese market changed our breeding program. It even changed the breeds we had in terms of being able to satisfy that high-end Japanese marbling market. So there was an example where we now have the beef CRC measured marbling. We understood its heritability. We understood how to model it. We started generating EBVs for marbling in the late 80s, early 90s as a direct response, and now those EBVs are very heavily used in several breeds. So yeah, and the work I'm doing in the north, yeah, there are market requirements for sure, there are feed requirements, but fertility or female reproduction is key. And that's why we're now looking at better measures. So in the past, we've used the days to calving EBV. It's a very good EBV, but it's slow to make change. And now with ultrasound scanning, with remote sensing technology, we're able to record better phenotypes, which means we can get more accurate EBVs at younger ages, particularly when we overlay the genomics. So yeah, we're never really ever focused on single traits, so we don't want to say we've made massive progress in just one trait. What we tend to focus on is what progress we've made in the overall breeding objective, where we've weighted each of the traits. So over time, what we've done through several research projects and also the work we do here at AGBU is to make sure that we've got that breeding objective well defined, so that we then make sure we're selecting the correct balance of those traits, and then for that balance of traits, make sure we've got the very best EBVs possible. As we go forward, we're going to find we don't have an EBV for a particular trait, and we're going to have to work out how do we work with industry, how do we work with funding bodies to get those new traits recorded such that we can put them into the genetic evaluation.
So is it safe to say that there'd probably be a fair few new traits being looked into over the coming years or over the next couple of decades to try and improve the amount of EBVs that there are, so people can make those selection decisions and tailor it to their breeding objectives, as you were talking about before? So we might see more coming into the system that are able to be used depending on the needs of, markets, producers, consumer requirements, all those sort of things. Yeah,
most definitely. So, consumers are becoming much more savvy about how their product is being produced, and we have to make sure that we're doing that in an ethically sustainable way. So, and that's the requirements coming from, social license to exist. And we can address some of that. It won't all be that, because some can be non-genetic. There are a lot of non-genetic outcomes that you can do, like in certain circumstances, pain relief if we're doing particular procedures. But we can also use genetics to genetically dehorn animals. And a consumer requirement might be that, those animals have to be treated differently in terms of how we're administering, pain relief. But there are traits, to do with welfare that we can make sure that we can, that we are selecting the right animals as well. Human health is probably going to become more important, and so the healthfulness of our product could come under scrutiny. And what can we do in terms of selection? What can we do in terms of non-selective, non-genetic outcomes to make sure that we can do that? Methane obviously is front and centre. There are non-genetic feed-based solutions being worked on very successfully, but also there's genetic variation that we can exploit. So yes, as we go forward, there'll be things that we haven't even thought of yet, particularly as technology, technology emerging in the abattoirs to allow us to measure traits that previously you had to come back and do in a lab. So we don't have genetic evaluations for some of those traits because they're just too expensive and difficult. But with the advent of new technologies, online, in abattoirs, then we can start to say, well, how do we develop a data capture to get that data and then get it into the genetic evaluation? And that's what we will continue to do into the future.
Genetics just sounds like such a powerful tool to be able to make those decisions and also shorten the period that you're seeing the changes, because you are selecting the right animals, so you're getting the change a lot faster than you would without knowing those values before that. But so we did touch a little bit before on mentioning there are different heritabilities with traits. So what does that kind of mean? Can you just break down, what that might mean when you're considering using genetics?
Yeah, some traits are more heritable than others. So the characteristic that you observe, more of that is in the progeny. It's less influenced by the environment. The best thing is we take all that out of your hands, or everyone's hands, that's already embedded in the EBV. So people don't need to know the heritability of the trait when they're working with it. We do when we're making the EBVs, and people will see, there's not as much spread, or it's not as easy to change this trait because there's not as much variation. But all that has been handled in the EBV. So people don't have to understand the EBVs. They just have to select on the EBVs. But there are downsides in terms of we can make selection much faster, which means we can actually inbreed much quicker. And so that is one of the risks of modern animal breeding. And it existed in the past, but people often didn't even know. But now, again, with our modern tools, we do have the risk, if you're using more and more intensive selection, that inbreeding can become a problem. And so there are lethal recessives in all organisms, so we have to watch that we don't multiply those up. And there is inbreeding depression for some fitness type traits when you select intensively. So we have to be responsible when we're doing animal breeding, that we have to monitor and manage inbreeding. And also there's a bigger risk with the more accuracy that you can go in the wrong direction faster. So it's also critical that people have clear breeding goals, because you can go down the wrong track faster now, particularly with genomics. So it's really critical that we understand our market requirements, we understand our environments, we understand the breeding objectives, and Brad's going to tell you all about that, because we can get there much faster. And that means we can go wrong much faster as well. So there are a few caveats to that. Everything's wonderful. We also have to have that responsibility of using these tools correctly, and providing people with information about inbreeding coefficients, expected inbreeding levels. We've got mate allocation algorithms to do mating systems to avoid or minimise or manage inbreeding. And also when genetic disorders come up, we're able to quite often now develop DNA tests that people can then make mating decisions based on their carrier status, which again, the tools are then helping us to fix a problem that is, again, biology. Mutations exist all the time. Every organism, every next generation, we're generating mutations. Some of those are beneficial, some of them are harmful. And we've got to make sure in animal breeding that we don't multiply up those deleterious ones, because then we're going to see those in our production systems.
From what you've described, David, it sounds like there's a whole suite of tools available for people making those selection decisions to tap into. But I'm curious, how do you see commercial producers tapping into these resources?
So commercial producers can use the differences between bulls to buy bulls that match their production system.
Yeah.
If they're on the coast, the tablelands, the plains, if they're down south, up north, then there'll be a different bull that will suit their production system. There will be also different bulls that will meet their markets, so whether they're going a domestic market, an export market, a high-end restaurant trade, then there'll be horses for courses. And so commercial producers can use EBVs to buy bulls that suit. In some cases, they might go into the learning of what EBVs are, but in a lot of cases, they can just rely on a seed stock breeder who is using EBVs to be making genetic progress. If they buy from that herd, they'll be improving their herd year after year. The real key to EBVs is for seed stock breeders to use them to make genetic improvement. And that's where EBVs can be a little bit misinterpreted or overused, is if people simply use them in marketing. Marketing's good because their commercial clients obviously buy on them, but when seed stock breeders start using EBVs to make genetic improvement, that's when we see the benefit to the industry, because they're the engine of genetic improvement. That's the commercial producers use the genetic improvement that's generated in the seed stock herds. So when we get whole breeds or breeders using EBVs, they can take a breed in a particular direction, and then commercial producers will be the beneficiaries of that selection. So that's probably, trying to simplify how people use those EBVs. And so it's up to the seed stock breeder in a lot of cases to do the recording, to keep the pedigrees, to do the genomics, and that's becoming more expensive. But in doing so, then they provide a genetically described product to their clients. But if they're using it in selection, then those cattle in their herds are getting better year after year.
Although you say it's getting more expensive, it sounds like the benefits are well and truly laid out on the table for everyone to see, with just how accurate it is as well, and it driving you towards those breeding objectives that you might have as a seed stock producer. But as a commercial producer, what sort of advice would you give to them if they've got their own goals? Conversation should they be having with their seed stock producers when it comes to buying a bull or a ram or a buck? What should they kind of be speaking to them about to try and help them drive towards their own breeding objectives and goals for buying that next sire for their herd as well?
Thing is that the commercial producer understands what is their breeding objective, because the seed stock breeder can't help them unless they've got clear definitions around what is your market, what is your weaning rate, what is your level of calving difficulty, really knowing your production system. Once you've got that, there are some simple tools in terms of indexes that would say, this would be the simple index that you would go to the sale and buy on, and then you just you list your bulls for that particular index, and then you might have 50 bulls, and then you go and find the most suitable bull, structural, soundness, temperament, whatever else you're looking at. So, if you know your index, if you don't, then yes, having a conversation with the seed stock breeder, they can help you determine that these 50 lots might be the most suitable bulls in their sale that would help your breeding objective. So it's all about knowing where you are and then benchmarking that against the bulls that are for sale. And without that knowledge, you could simply align yourself with a breeder whose bulls have done the job for you in the past and buy another bull from them. So you can make it very simple, or you can make it extremely complex as you like.
That sounds great. It sounds like there's just a lot of tools available, and even as a seed stock producer, recording is important, but it sounds like also as a commercial producer that performance recording is also as important, just to be able to benchmark your herd or your flock and understand where you're currently at. So
and getting carcass feedback. So if you're selling steers domestically and you can get the feedback sheets, or if you're putting your cattle into feedlots, getting performance back from those cattle from the feedlots gives you an idea of where you might have deficiencies or strengths, and then that will dictate the sort of bull buying you might do. And also keeping a monitor on your rebreed rates, your rate of conceptions in your heifers. And yes, you're going to have year to year fluctuations because of the environment, but if you can benchmark year in, year out, and suddenly you start having lots more calving difficulties, or you seem to have lower rebreeds, then that could be a focus of your next bull buying, based on some of that feedback that you're getting.
I think that is great advice and very practical as well. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast and sharing some of your very valuable time with me today, David. It's been great to discuss the benefits of genetics and what it can offer for commercial and seed stock producers, and also some great examples of just how it's been used in different industries. I think that's really highlighted the power of genetics as well, and it's always something to keep an eye out for. It sounds like there's going to be a heap of new traits and new projects coming up in the future. It sounds like a very, very quickly evolving space, which is exciting to watch.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Genetics in the Paddock with Emily, a podcast produced by the extensive livestock genetics team within New South Wales DPI. We hope you've enjoyed this deep dive into the world of genetics and its impact on livestock production. If you found this episode informative and engaging, please consider subscribing to the podcast and leaving a review. Your feedback is essential in helping me to continue to bring you valuable content on livestock genetics. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions for future topics or guests, please don't hesitate to reach out to me on social media or through email. We love hearing from our listeners and are always eager to explore the subjects that matter most to you.